Buddy, as Katie mentioned, this year you're required to use the same form that districts are used to fill out your tentative budget, your final budget, and any amended budgets. For most of you, this is probably new, although NDE did allow charters to choose last year, and I believe the year prior to that, which format they could use. It's my understanding, I know at Oasis Academy, we stuck with the old form. As I went through this form, there's a lot of stuff that's centered around districts that doesn't really apply to charters in this workbook. So I opted not to use it the last couple of years, even though we had the option. Some of you may have gone ahead and tried to use it knowing it was coming, but we're going to go through this and we are going to explain as best we can, tab by tab, what really applies to charters. And it could vary a little bit depending on what funds each of your schools has opened that your boards have authorized. But in general, a lot of it will be similar school by school as far as what applies to you. We'll go tab by tab. I'm going to skip around a little bit in an order that I think you should follow to fill it in and then back into the summary tabs, which are your AA schedules. But again, I'm going to share my screen here. And as I finish talking about each tab, I'll stop for questions. So rather than at the end, take questions and bounce around, let's just tackle each tab as we go. So if you have questions, I'll pause and please go ahead and we'll tackle those at that time. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here real quick. And everybody let me know if you can see my screen. Katie, Michael, am I good? Okay, so this is schedule 1. All right, this is the first tab in the new workbook. This is really your letterhead tab. So this will need to be put out into a PDF, signed and uploaded along with the workbook to Epicenter and to NDE. This looks a little similar to the last one, although it does have a couple of new components to it. Number one, you're supposed to put this on your letterhead. That's the instructions that are in the instruction workbook or the instruction PDF, and that's what it says here. You're going to put your school name here in cell A19. I would highlight that it's your tentative budget. Note that there. This line, line 22, is a new line. It wasn't in the old budget workbook. So in here, you're supposed to put a total in cell C22, it looks like, of your state education revenue. Now, this total should come from another tab, and I'll get to that in a minute. But this is really the sum total of your PCFP funds, your local special education funding, and any of your ELL at-risk and GATE funding, if you get that. Basically everything that's associated with the PCFP funding. That would be the total that goes in this cell here, C22. And again, you can pull that from another tab, and when we get there, I'll make sure to note that. This cell over here, J22, this should be the total of your debt service funds. Now, this is revenue. So this would be, for districts, this would be any of their tax dollars that they're getting to service their debt. I don't believe this applies to any charter schools. Now, you're going to hear me say that throughout this workbook a few different times. The reason is this is Department of Taxation's workbook. NDE did not make this. NDE also generally doesn't see these. School districts send these directly to Department of Taxation. We, however, have to send this to NDE and the SPCSA. So all you schools have to send that. So when we met with NDE, there are still some questions on what exactly applies to charters and what exactly is specific to districts. So there are some gray areas in here, and those will probably be fleshed out throughout this process when Department of Taxation gets all of these and sends questions back. However, we are currently unable to clarify some of this directly with Department of Taxation. So we kind of have to follow the chain of command, which is through NDE, back through Department of Taxation. We're working on that. So if there's some gray areas in here, I apologize. It's just kind of the way it is for right now. So again, I want to be clear, this cell probably doesn't apply to most charter schools. If you, however, if you are a school that your board has approved opening of a 400 fund for debt service and you have that designated fund open, which would be an auditable fund, it would be in your 400s, and you have a designated revenue stream set aside to service your debt, maybe you have bonds or something like that, then that total revenue would go here. Otherwise, I don't think it applies to you. So again, total of your state funds here out of the PCFP, total of your debt service funds. Okay, jumping down the line 28, you're going to list the number of funds your board has approved. Most of you probably have 4 or 5 funds. You have your 100 general fund, your 250 special education fund, your ELL and at risk, which are 206, 208. Maybe you have a gate fund, and then maybe you have a couple other funds. If you opened a capital fund, something like that, you would put the total of your funds here. So if you got 4, 5, 6 funds, whatever. For districts, this is all over the place. I know there's districts that have only operate 7 or 8 funds. If you looked at like Carson City School District, I think they have like 23 funds that they operate. So it really depends on what you've chosen to do as a school and what your board has authorized you to open. That would go there. And then in cell I-28, this is the total of all your funds, excluding proprietary funds. I'll get to those in a second. This would be your total expenditures for all funds, including capital projects, and including contingency. So if you are a school that sets aside up to the maximum of 3% contingency or somewhere in that range, 0 to 3%, you would make sure that this total expenditure line includes your contingency. So that would be the sum total here. And then the next cell right here, F29, this would be the total of proprietary funds. Proprietary funds are those funds you operate like a private business where you have revenue and you're trying to generate profit. So some school districts operate stadiums, they operate like meal services separate from food service, catering services, things like that. Maybe you operate a student store and you have significant revenue tied to that, and you actually, your board approved opening an enterprise fund to track all of that, where the revenue pays for the expenses, and your goals to generate a profit on that. That would be an enterprise fund, and the total of those expenditures would go here. I'm pretty sure the majority of you don't have a separate designated fund for enterprise funds. Even if you collect fees and stuff, it's probably in your general fund. But if you do, that would go in this estimated proprietary fund cell here, F29. Lastly, for your tentative budget, this was new to me, and maybe some of you knew this. I've never seen this before, but tentative budget only is to be certified by your board designated school official who can sign off on this. Maybe you have a CFO, maybe it's your principal or your executive director, but that is the person who's authorized by the board to sign off on the tentative budget. You sign it, date it, make sure this is on your PDF scan copy. You do not need approved governing signatures. Do I think it's best practice personally? Yes. I think your board should see your tentative budget and sign off on it. Our school always did. This was new to me. Apparently with districts, it's only for the final budget and any amended finals that your board actually has to sign off on these lines and be presented. So Katie, if you're good with that, I think the schools can have the option and do what districts are doing on this tentative. Okay, good. So if just your executive director or your CFO is authorized to sign off on it, that's all you need, name, title. Last thing, your scheduled budget hearing based on this tentative budget, according to these new instructions, has to take place between May 19th and May 31st. And you have to list that on this tentative budget. The date and time, the place, this is the notification to the public. And that's when you have to have that scheduled and when your budget hearing has to take place. I know there's been some questions about budget hearings in the past. The budget hearings are designed for the public to have time to look at this tentative budget, have input, and then give you time to go back and create your final budget that's due by June 8th. That's generally what it's for, and you have to note that here. So with that, I'm going to stop right here on this first form to see if there are any questions. And Katie, Michael, if I missed anything, please jump in.
It does look like there's a question about PCFP at-risk funding being considered a government fund type. But I'm wondering if you're going to get into that in a later tab, in the revenue tab.
Okay, I will actually open that right now. Can everybody see my screen that says fund codes? Or am I still on the old screen?
We can see it.
Okay, this is the NDE chart of accounts. This is the fund tab. It's right after the title tab. Your funds, here's your 100 fund. In your special funds, if you are getting PCFP, English Language Learner funds, at-risk funds, here's your fund numbers. Gifted and talented, here's special education. Even if, this is my understanding, talking to NDE when the PCFP first come out, for those of you who don't know, I also sit on the Commission on School Funding. I've been on that since 2019, so we've been in kind of charge of implementing the PCFP. You do have to open these funds, English Language Learner, at-risk, gifted and talented, so you would have a separate fund. For example, even if it's a small amount of money. So at Oasis Academy, I think the last year we got a total of like $9,000 of at-risk money. We still had a separate at-risk fund that we had open that we would track revenue and expenses. So make sure that your funds match up with NDE's fund numbers that are in the chart of accounts. Debt service, there's your 400. And if you had proprietary funds like food service or enterprise funds, that would be 600. And of course, I'll point this one out, student activity funds. If you have club funds that you're the custodian for, those should be in a 900 fund. So I hope that answered the question. Any other questions?
Not in the chat, but people may have additional questions. I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll give it a second. Okay. It doesn't look like we have any additional questions on the first tab. So let's go to schedule B1. If I need to blow any of these up, someone to just speak up and let me know if I need to zoom in on them a little bit. Okay, B1, this tab is new as well. It's different than the old budget tab. The whole top section of this, lines 2 through 7, do not apply to charter schools. We block those cells out. If for some reason you have a version that's not blocked out, there was one that was uploaded to Epicenter end of last week. Use that version, but we locked these cells. This has to do with assessed value, net proceeds of mines, minerals. This stuff does not apply, those top rows, to charter, so you can skip that. FTEs, this is new to the budget tab from the old budget workbook. You have your ending year, FY24. This should really match a lot of this. Anytime we have an FY24 ending year column, it should match what your audit, what went to your auditors. Obviously, FTEs don't necessarily go to your auditors, but costs and revenue do. So total employees, classroom teachers, total enrollment for last year, for this current year, and then your budgeted year is column N for this tentative budget. I don't believe these rows apply to anybody, but if for some reason you have students being transported to your school from out of state, or if you are transporting schools out of state, students out of state to other schools, that's what these rows right here are for. I don't think that applies to any of you. And then you'll have a total weighted enrollment. Now, one thing I want to point out in this workbook before we get too far in it, unlike most state workbooks that you guys are used to, the 387 report or the old budget workbook, there are very few cells or columns in this workbook that have formulas pre-populated for you. You are expected to do your own formulas, total your own cells, your own rows, your own columns. That's how this workbook is designed. I know it's a little unusual. I think that's because, probably, in my opinion, because districts vary so widely in how they do their budgeting and accounting, and have so many different funds. Districts have flexibility to do their own formulas in here. So you do have to do that. These are 2 cells. This page is one of the only ones I've seen that has formulas already pre-populated. So make sure you have your total weighted enrollment in line 31. Then Here's where you're going to put your state funding. Here's your adjusted base per pupil amount. This should be your average weighted daily enrollment. That'll pull from cell N31, goes in here. This should be your total PCFP base funding in cell L39. So that should be what you're planning for your total PCFP base funding. Then you're going to put your total for at-risk, ELL, gifted and talented, your total weighted, and then your total local special education funding in row 47. This auxiliary services, you guys aren't getting any auxiliary services. That's part of the PCFP funding waterfall. Some of you may have some transportation dollars associated with the governor's set aside. It's my understanding that would not apply here. So these cells should probably be blank. If you are getting some food service dollars that come on your PCFP payments, which you may, then you would put that food service here. But otherwise, these are probably blank for the majority of you. And then you're going to have a total funding from the state education fund. This cell LN55 is what should go back on schedule 1 in cell C20, C22. Okay, so I'll repeat that. This sum of total state education fund should go back on schedule 1 in that cell C22. Now you'll notice on this tab that your quarterly special education payments are not on here. That's because those are not technically part of the PCFP funding coming out of the state education fund. Those are separate, but your local SPED funding, that's part of your local special education dollars, that's really general fund dollars, that does go on here. Okay, so, and again, list your charter school down here, and then you're done with this tab. I'll stop there. Any questions on schedule B1? Okay, hearing none. I'm gonna keep moving quickly. If I'm moving too fast, somebody please speak up. I'll cover anything again, stop and cover something. So just go ahead. Oh, it does look like we have a question, Robert.
Hi, I'm sorry. This is our first year with the SPCSA. For the interim budget, do we just use our current per pupil adjusted base?
Yes, because yeah. Those haven't been released, so you're going to use what your estimated numbers are for next year. So that's a great question. Yes, we don't know, to my knowledge. Obviously, the legislative session's in right now, so we don't know what next year's funding. Probably won't know until, I don't know, some years it's June, July before we know. So yeah, safe budgeting would be to use your current years. Some of you I know will probably budget a small increase, 1 to 3%, 1 to 5%, something like that. I do know some schools are budgeting increases in ELL and at risk based on their October 1 count from this current school year. That's fine. So that's up to you guys how you do that. But great question. Yes.
Hey, Dusty.
Yeah.
This is Melissa. I do just want to reiterate that what is in the proposed budget right now is only a $2 per pupil increase. So I just want to reiterate what Dusty said, that if you do this based on like a 3% increase, you're probably not going to get that. So to be conservative, like he said, a good approach can be to use your current number, because the increase that's proposed is literally $2 per pupil. It's not much of anything.
There you go. Excellent. So I mean, if it were me, I wouldn't even put the $2 in there. But anyways, that's up to you guys. Again, I know on your weighted fund and definitely local SPED, I would probably roll forward whatever you got allocated this last biennium or the biennium that you're in now. You might just go ahead and put that in there as well. Okay. Any other questions on this? Thanks, Melissa, for jumping in on that. Okay, we're going to skip these AA tabs, these AA modified, AA1 and AA1 modified, and go to schedule BB-5. This is where these B schedules are what is very similar to the standard budget workbook we've all been using for years. This should look familiar, and you should jump to here and fill this in, and then we'll go back to those A schedules that are summary schedules, okay? So it starts in the old workbook, you had two tabs. You had a revenue tab and an expenditure. Now they've broken these up, and these schedules BB-5 through all the way out through like BB, I think 11 or 12, are just portions of all the different function codes and program codes, but it's the same format for the most part. So I'm going to start in schedule BB-5 is your revenue tab. All right. These rows 7 through 12 do not apply to you. They're districts. They have to do with net proceeds of mines, designated tax dollars, those sorts of things coming from their counties. They don't apply to you. Okay. You'll see you have 4 columns. You have your what should match your audit. Okay. Column D. Then you have E, which should be your the current budget you're operating under right now. Those numbers should go in column E. So whatever your latest amended budget that your board approved, if it was your June 8th budget from last year, that's what should go in column E. Column F is your tentative approved budget. That's the budget you're doing now here. And then G will be for your June 8th budget. So you'll leave column G blank. That'll be for your June final budget. All right. So this is by revenue code on the left. Everybody should be familiar with that, but if not, I'll just quickly show you on the NDE chart of accounts. If you go to the revenue tab, this is where all those codes should match, going down from 1,000 local sources, 2,000, 3,000 state sources. Okay, this should match how you're doing your budget. This is the codes you should be following, this NDE code workbook here. So you're going to fill in all your revenue. Here's like your PCFP funding. Here's your local SPED funding. Everything goes through here down to your federal sources, whether it's pass through or direct from federal sources. This is your summary. Pretty self-explanatory tab. Again, you have to put your formulas in at the bottom here. So make sure this last row 56, that you put your sum formula in to summarize the column above each one of those. Okay. Any questions on this tab? And again, it looks like at the bottom of all these tabs, you need to put your school. And then I think maybe in this cell, your total, I actually don't know what row 59 is for, if that's a total of your tentative budget resources, but that's already listed here. So at least make sure you put your charter school name down at the bottom there. Okay, any questions on the revenue tab? Pretty self-explanatory, but if there are, please jump in now. Cool.
I think
okay.
Nakam had a question.
Okay, go ahead, Nakam.
Does the December final budget go in column G, or is this form not used for that?
December, which December? Like this last December?
No, December, it would be December 2025.
So if you do an amended final, so after your June 8th budget, that's interesting because the old workbook had an amended final column in it. So I actually don't know the answer to that.
Well, I think column G looks like it's for fiscal year 26. So I think that would be, and Dusty, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that would be the final budget that gets done in June.
It would be, but what Nakam's asking is if they do an amended final budget in December.
Oh, I see.
For FY26.
We actually had a finding from an audit a few years back because we didn't do a December budget. So since then, we've done a December budget, and it's pretty much almost exactly the same in June, but to avoid the finding, we do an amended budget in December.
Yeah, and schools do amended budgets at different times throughout the year. If you get a brand new revenue stream or a grant or something that you need board approval, you can do an amended budget throughout the year at any time, as long as your board approves it. So I don't know. I don't know if you're supposed to copy and paste this over, or maybe those don't go to we'll find that out. We'll find out if amended budgets go to Department of Taxation or NDE, because there was a column for those in the old workbook that charter schools used. So that is a question we will ask. Great question, Malcolm. Okay, any other questions on this schedule, the revenue schedule? Cool. Okay. Katie, just to double check, are you monitoring the chat? Because I am not.
I am monitoring the chat.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you very much. Okay, now we get into the expenditure tabs. So, actually, I apologize. There's one more. This is the total of your resources. So Schedule BB6 is the end of the revenue schedule. This is where you will list any revenue associated with debt. So if you got a loan greater than 12 months, you sold some assets, transfers in from other funds, you would transfers from other funds, you would put that here in this. And this is also where you are going to put your opening fund balance from the prior year. So in column F for the tentative budget, if your audited ending fund balance from last year, based on the fund basis, not on your not with the GASB adjustments, but based on your fund accounting basis, that would go here in your opening fund balance. And then you would have your total opening fund balance. Total of all resources is the total of all your revenue, which goes in the cell F16, including debt revenue, plus your opening fund balance, and that gives you your total resources for the year. That should be in row 23. So again, you do include debt proceeds that you get throughout this year, budgeted in this section here. Any questions on BB6?
Hey Dusty, this is Melissa. I'm super
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you again. I had to wait till I got back to the office to get the actual number. I just want to flag for everyone, this is totally preliminary, but when Dusty was talking about the revenue and your special ed revenue in particular, we are anticipating what's been presented to the legislature equates to a decrease per pupil from about 4,200 this year to 3,700 this year. So again, I just want to flag for everyone, it's much easier to get more money than it is to cut things out of a preliminary budget. So just please, everyone be aware that that funding is, the state special education funding is not looking great for charter schools next year.
And Mel, just to clarify, that is the quarterly state special education. You're not talking about local special education. You're talking about state special ed funding, right? Mel, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm looking at it to just make sure. State special education program funding.
Okay. Then yes,
Yeah, that's what it
that's,
says.
yeah. Because that's a separate appropriation. So that's row 44 on schedule BB5. So again, I would be conservative on that. Even if you had an increase in your October 1 count in 2024 from 2023, think about how you want to look at your revenue there.
Can we
Okay.
repeat those numbers just one more time, Melissa?
Sure. So last year, it's not funded on a per pupil basis, but last year it equated, or this year, it equated to about $4,250 per pupil. Next year, it's going to equate to about $3,703 per pupil in what in the recommended budget. And of course, I want to reiterate, like, nothing about this is final, and we are obviously working to get that number higher, but I just would hate for you to make plans on a budget on a higher number and then be in a position where you're making cuts in your final budget. So this year it equated to approximately 4,250 per pupil. Next year it will equate to approximately $3,703 per pupil as in the recommended budget now.
And just as a reminder, your special education funding is based on your prior year's October 1 count. So even if you're anticipating an increase in special education enrollment for next fiscal year, FY26, you will not see an increase in funding because it'll still be based off of your October 1, 2024 count day number for special education. Okay, any other questions on revenue? Schedules BB5 and BB6. Cool, okay. Now moving on to expenditures. Okay, so a couple things to note. I recently reviewed a couple schools' budgets and I saw a little confusion on how these budget forms are organized and how they were filled out. This is organized by program and function up here. It's not organized by fund. It's organized by program. And so when you look at the NDE chart of accounts and you go to the program tab, it is different than the funds. Okay, your funds are the full fiscal funds that get audited every year that, again, you probably have 4, 5, 6 of them. Programs are the separate set of codes. They're the plan of activities, and you could have these, you know, in various different funds. So first off, it's organized by your fund numbers up here, which is regular, which generally goes in your general fund. Special education programs, special programs usually go in your special education fund, although ELL and at risk, these programs go in their own fund. And then, of course, the big one you have, I'll go to Fund 900. If you have co-curricular, extracurricular activities, that's Program 900. You'll see that in the budget form. Undistributed. Okay, this is a big section I see schools missing both on the 387 and in the budget. This is everything that's not directly associated with students. This is where your admin goes, your maintenance, grounds, all those sorts of things, and it's generally associated with your general fund. If you do have some undistributed programs and other funds, it's probably rare. So this should be part of your general fund, but it is broken out separately when we go to the expenditure tabs, and you'll see it. So this starts with regular programs, 1,000 instructions, and it's just like what we saw in the old budget form. You break out your salaries, benefits, purchase services, supplies, and your capital purchases. They go in each program listed and each separate function. So if you're spending over that $5,000 capitalization threshold for items that would be coded to object code 700, you would break that out in every single program and function where it goes. So for example, in your classrooms, if you're buying some technology that's over $5,000, and please consult with your back office service providers, or if you are an accountant, you know that there's new rules around single orders of items that are less than 5,000, but if they're on one order, they may be subject to capitalization. That goes in your 700 line. I know a lot of people aren't familiar with that. I'm going to jump back over real quick to the NDE chart of accounts, but item 700, object code 700, is for all those items that are greater than the $5,000 capitalization threshold. It includes if you purchase land, buildings, equipment, vehicles, and any IT technology, software, hardware, etc., that's over that 5,000, or possibly a culmination of a bunch of items on one order that goes in that 700 line. Okay, so I just want to point that out in case you guys aren't doing that yet. So we start with program 100. You got your 1,000 instruction, 2,700 student transportation. If you're paying for any transportation directly for students to and from school, that stuff goes there. Other district support, Generally, you're not going to use this as part of your regular programs. Okay, then when you go to special programs, this is a sum of all those 200 programs. Same exact thing. These just repeat themselves. Instruction, student transportation, other support. Again, these 2,900 codes you generally won't use. So that's all that's on schedule BB7. BB8 continues through your programs. So we go to gifted and talented. And actually, okay, so then we go to gifted and talented's broken out there. Vocational and technical. I apologize, I was just looking for something. I don't know that most of you have vocational programs. Maybe you do. So anyways, this just goes through program by program. Here's your 400s, summer school, schedule BB10, goes into adult ed, community service programs. Again, a lot of this stuff districts do, charter schools do not, so don't worry about it if you have a whole bunch of these sections that are blank. Schedule BB11. Here's your co-curricular. A lot of you will have this, especially if you're operating a middle school or a high school. Here's where all your coaches stuff goes. Anything associated with your co-curricular sports and activities. If you're transporting kids for games or paying a subcontractor to transport your kids, that goes in here. Actually, that would go under, I'm sorry, 920 athletics, but it goes in the 900 program code. Co-curriculars would be maybe FFA. If you got specific programs like FFA, student council, that would be your 910s, athletics 920. And then going on to BB12, and I will stop at the end of these BB schedules here for questions. Now you get into your undistributed, your 000 program code. This is where all your student support goes, okay? Student support like counselors, nurses, any instructional coaches, things like that go in here. General administration is your board level stuff. So if you do board trainings or you have anything, maybe a board designated secretary, that goes in 2,300. 2,400 is your school administration. This is where I've seen some of these undistributed programs scattered back out through the other programs, like regular programs and stuff. It should not be. It should be as far undistributed. Undistributed means these support all your other programs. They support everything that's going on in classrooms, athletics, summer school, all that stuff. That's what all these are for. Central services, if you're paying back office service providers, accountants, those sorts of things, so on and so forth. So that's what your, and we're still, if I go to schedule BB13, we are still in the undistributed 000 program. Now we're into function code 2600 with its maintenance. So maintenance of your buildings. 2700 is student transportation that's not already associated with a specific program that you may have already identified above. Any other support. And again, if you need direction on what these function codes are, refer back to your NDE chart of accounts, and there's an explanation on all of those. And then we get into food service. If you are operating food service, that's where this goes. Even if it's in actually the enterprise funds I think are a separate tab, so that would not go here. We'll get to that tab in a minute. Okay, if you bought land, that goes in here. And of course, if you're doing any construction projects, you're improving land, moving dirt, you're paying architects, you're remodeling buildings, you're putting in a playground, that would be site improvement, paving your parking lot, building improvement, you're doing some remodels inside, all of that gets captured down here. Again, a lot of it would go in your 700 property services, or if you're paying a contractor, those I believe are spelled out in the 500s for things like construction contracts, contracts with architects, so on and so forth. Okay, the last tab is your totals. That's schedule BB14A. All right. There's one last function as part of your undistributed program 000, that's your 4,900. Then we get to your totals. So you're going to total all your 4,000s. Then, so again, this line right here, line 14, is the total of all your facility acquisition and construction. So pay attention to these labels because some of these subtotals are specific to functions. So like this line 14 is specific to the 4,000 function. So those 5 sections above, you would total that here. Okay, very important, line 15, fund transfers, all right? So if you have transfers out, because again, you're in your expenditures, if you are transferring money out to other funds, that total should go in this row. So if you're transferring money out of your general fund to balance out your special education fund, your ELL fund, your at-risk fund, or something else, that's got to go in line 15. Interfund transfer, I don't really know anybody that uses that other than districts. So I don't think row 16 applies to you. If you have a different interpretation, I think it's fine. And then total of all your undistributed expenditures go here. So total of that program 000 goes on line 17. So all those functions from 2,100 through 4,900, that total goes in your line 17. Then we get to line 19, or line 18 is a total of all expenditures, all programs, all expenditures is line 18. So you're going to summarize all your different programs from 100, 200, 400, all, et cetera, all the way to your 000. That'll be your total. Then comes your contingency line, number 19. As a best practice, most districts do this. I believe a lot of you are doing it. Contingency is a percentage of your total expenditures. So think about it as every dollar you spend, you're setting aside up to 3 cents per dollar for unforeseen expenses. A lot of schools, districts budget as a standard 3%. They just budget 3 cents on every dollar that they spend. They're setting aside, their board is reserving as a potential expenditure line item in case they need it. Maybe a pipe bursts in your building and it floods a bunch of classrooms and you don't have it spelled out in your budget for that, right? Nobody plans for those sorts of things. That's where your board can designate contingency and your board can release contingency if something like that happened. So it's a best practice. Is it required? It's debatable on whether it's required, but regardless, you cannot exceed 3%. So you can't set aside 10% of every dollar that you spend or 5%. You can only set aside 3% of every dollar that you spend. Okay. Then after contingency is considered an expenditure. It's considered money that's gone and spent. You'll have your ending fund balance. So this is your budgeted ending fund balance after you, theoretically, after you spent your contingency would be your ending fund balance. So for column E, that should be your audited ending fund balance on your fund basis accounting, not your statement of activities that includes your GASB adjustments like PERS, capital lease adjustments, present values of all those sorts of things. Don't use that. Use your estimated fund balance on your audit. That should be in column E. Column F, of course, is your current fiscal year's budget. And in column G is your tentative budget. H will be your June budget. Okay. Total ending fund balance right there. Total applications. I believe this is the sum of your total expenditures, contingency, and your ending fund balance. This should basically be all of that totaled in line 24. Okay, I know that was a lot. I was talking kind of fast. I'll stop there for any questions on those revenue and expenditure, actually the expenditure schedules that we just went over.
So there's a couple questions in the chat. The first is just to confirm all fixed asset items currently being capitalized will show up in 700.
No, not if you purchase them Remember, this is not a balance sheet. So if you purchased them in a prior year, including this current fiscal year, specifically for your tentative budget, I'm referring to column G. It's only for things you are purchasing in next fiscal year. If you did purchase it in this current year, like your current FY25 budget, then yeah, any capital expenditures go wherever, whatever program they're associated with or function they're associated with, they would go in line 700. So if you bought a building, you bought a vehicle, the full price of that vehicle, whether you financed it or not, would go in these 700 line items.
Monica, does that answer your question? Okay, and then Robert has a second question in the chat, but it looks like he's ready to ask it to you.
Well, I think you just answered it. So if we had a capitalized lease, this is where it would go also. If we were doing some, we leased a new building and it needed to be capitalized, it would go under 4,700 or 4,500. I'm sorry. Yeah, 4,700.
It's actually would not go here. It's going to go on a different tab. Now, the sum of your lease payments would. So if you, whatever your total year allocated lease payments, would go because you do have a lease. So it would go in, where are we? Actually, no, your debt payments. So let me back up here. Your debt payments are going to go on a separate tab. They are not on here. The old workbook below here did have your debt service payments. This workbook, it's on a separate tab, and I'll get to that in a second. So that's a good question.
Can I ask the question another way?
Yeah, now let me back up. Rental payments would, like rental payments, if you were renting something and you had a short-term rental, that's actually an object code, and that would go in there. But go ahead, Robert.
So if you during fiscal year 2026, if we have a new lease that becomes a capital lease under GASB, that would that capitalized balance would be on the 4,500 building acquisition and then under 700 property for object. You know, let's say the future
yeah,
payment, the present value
right.
was $1 million of the lease payments. The $1 million would go under like G19, right?
I actually would not put that here, and I'll tell you why. There is a separate tab where you will capitalize that and show your total debt. What you would put here, though, is your lease payments, because there is an object code. So for under, and actually it would be back here for, let's say, operating maintenance of plants, there is a purchase service line item that's specific to leases. And so the 12 months of leases that would be in this budget would go as an expenditure. They would be captured as an expenditure. But the rest of the lease that would be captured in this workbook as debt, and that's on a separate tab. And I'll show you that in a second. I understand what you're saying, and it is complicated, but I do not believe if you purchased a building, of course, and you took out a loan, yes, the full purchase price of that building, let's say if it was $5 million, would go building acquisition and construction. It would go right here, and you would have a line item for $5 million in here, and you would also have loan revenue to match back on the loan revenue section of the revenue tab. A lease, you would just expense out, as far as this tab is concerned, your 12 months of lease payments for this current year. Same if you were renting other equipment. Maybe you got a long-term 5-year rental on a piece of equipment. You're only going to include the portion that's this year in this tab. And then when we get to the debt schedule, you'll see that. Okay, any other questions? Christina?
So kind of going back to this question on the rent payments, we're under GASB, we're currently doing the interest and the ROU as depreciation. Is that considered like so the interest would be 892 for us. So would that be that would go 2600 and be in the miscellaneous and other category?
So yeah, so
Okay.
according to the ND chart of accounts, right? And I'm going to refer
Mhm.
back to this because this is what these budget templates are built on, as well as the 387 report. You have specific codes for things like debt service, including principal, debt related redemption of principal, interest, right? And then in your function codes, of course, if you have something for a building, let's say if you are leasing a building, that would go down in those building codes, um, maintenance of buildings,
Mhm.
and that would go down to the appropriate function code for those. And then, of course, if you're buying something, then that goes in those same acquisition codes. But again, let's revisit that after we go to the debt tab, because I think it might be more clear when you see that specific tab. Okay, any other questions? All right, we're going to skip to Schedule C-1. Pull this up. Okay, so this is somewhat similar to the old debt tab that was on the old workbook. I think it was tab 7 on the old form. This is where you're going to list all your debt. Now, again, a lot of this won't apply to you guys. So you're going to list the fund it's associated with, whether it's general fund or if you have a separate fund. If you do have a board authorized capital fund and that's where you're going to hold that debt, then that's where it would go. But it'll be your fund. And then in column B, you're going to say what type of debt it is based on these Department of Taxation codes up here. None of you really have general obligation bonds or anything like that because those are bonds that are backed specifically by property tax dollars that school districts have. I'm assuming basically that leaves revenue bonds, and the revenue you're using to service any of your bonds is really probably your PCFP revenue, unless you have a dedicated revenue stream of some sort that's servicing that debt. They're probably what's considered a revenue bond. And then, of course, if you have just general mortgages, something like that. But this is where you also have capital leases. And in your instructions, and I'm going to go to that tab and I'm going to point it out in what it says for Schedule C1 is that outstanding amounts on capital leases should be included on this schedule if the obligation represents sums due on lease/purchase agreements where the benefits and risks of the ownership are those of the school district. The total amount entered on the schedule should agree with amounts reported in the annual independent audit report. So basically your last year audited balance on your capital leases, you're going to show that basically, and I'm assuming then it's the outstanding amounts on capital leases should be included on this schedule. To me, that says it's the total amount of the lease payments you have to make, not necessarily the present value of those, the capitalized value. But I am not an accountant, and I would check with your accountant on that, how much you're going to put on that. If you're going to put basically the present value of all your future payments, or if you're going to put the sum value of all of those. I don't really know the answer to that question, but this is where that would go. And then, of course, you're going to say when it was issued, whether it was bonds or when you signed your capital lease, if there's an understood interest rate, your beginning balance, ending balance, interest payable, principal payable, and total. And that goes on this Schedule C1. Michelle.
Okay, just to go back to piggyback a little bit off of Robert and Christina's question, I still have some confusion on lease payments, budgeting the lease payments versus the ROU liability. Normally, we don't list the lease payments, the actual lease payments in, let's say, 441, right, as an expense. We have the schedule for the ROU lease liability, the depreciation and interest, and it goes as an expense on that. So what we're budgeting is not, if it's $12,000 a year lease payments, let's say, I don't put that in 2610 441, right, as lease payment expense. It has to do with the ROU liability rule, where accounting rule, where the life of the lease is depreciated over the life of the lease. Sorry, life of the lease, and then taken from that schedule, that annual amount is what's expensed or put in the budget as an expense, because each month it's depreciated out. Depreciation versus interest. Is that different? Because that seems like I'm now normally I would put it on the expense tab under my, 791, I think it is, and like Christina said, 892 or something like that. So I'm just curious, is that different?
So it's a good question. And I think it's the cause of a lot of the confusion I see on the 387s and some of these budgets. You got to remember, your audit really presents two forms, right? It presents your statement of activities, including all the various GASME adjustments. It basically takes the governmental accounting and almost converts it to like for-profit accounting, where you have your balance sheet, your assets, you only expense out your depreciation, et cetera. The fund accounting, the governmental fund accounting is different. It's basically capturing everything you're writing checks for. So if you go back to those expense tabs, you wouldn't normally in a business expense out an asset. If you went and bought a vehicle, you would depreciate it, right? And you would only count, if you had a loan, you would only count the expense on the interest expense on that loan. That's not how the fund accounting works. Your ending fund balance should essentially be net of all the checks you write. And that includes any revenue that comes into you in a form of a loan and goes back out to purchase something. That's what is included on all those schedules. So you're doing the same thing with assets. You're capturing the full value of the asset as a quasi expense, even though that you generally are going to adjust that in your statement of activities in the audit. Your auditor is going to adjust that based on your capital depreciation schedule, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to think about it more of, what am I writing checks for throughout the year? And you're writing checks for those lease payments. And so those really should be captured in your expense schedules. Does that make sense?
Somewhat. All right.
Yeah,
I'll
I mean,
yeah.
these workbooks aren't designed to be captured as your audit adjusts them to. That's why you have two different you have a net position in your audit, and you also have an ending fund balance, and they're two different things, right?
Yeah.
This should be associated with that ending fund balance, which captures things like capital expenditures, which would be your lease expenditure for the year.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, any other questions on C1? Okay, I'm going to jump back to CC. This tab, I'll be honest, I don't think applies to charters, but NDE thinks it might. So this is really kind of a summary of tab C1. But there's stuff in here with property taxes, other resources. I don't really know. If you do have specific resources other than your PCFP revenue that's designated to pay for your debt, then, and if you're holding any of that in investments, I know some of you have bonds and you have, a portion of those bonds reserved for the payments at the very end, and those are probably earning something, then some of that would go into here. But if you don't really have bond financing and stuff, this tab doesn't really apply to you. So if those of you, you can attempt to fill this out as best you see fit. But I'll be honest, I'm not going to be much help on this tab because, again, I don't really think it applies to you because most schools don't have a designated revenue stream like property taxes to service their bond debt. But we did leave it unlocked based on the feedback we got from NDE. Okay, I'm going to go to schedule J1. Not a lot left to go through out of this budget. We've covered the meat of it so far. So proprietary funds, I don't think anybody really has any proprietary funds that I am aware of, but we did leave it open in case you have some proprietary funds or some enterprise funds that you need to capture that with. I don't think I saw any listed on the 387 report when I went through all the schools. So I don't think that applies to you guys. If it does, then by all means, fill these out for those funds. And if you have any questions on it, let me know. Okay, schedule I. This is if you are dealing with transfers to and from any other districts. Again, we left this unlocked. I don't think it applies to any charter schools, but if you have transportation or you got tuition, you're paying another district tuition for something for your students, then especially if maybe you're paying a district to transport your kids or something like that, then you might capture that on this tab here. I don't think it applies to most of you, but if it does specifically to that, then go ahead and capture that here. Okay, Schedule T. This one does match the old workbook. This captures, I'm gonna knock them. It looks like you have a question.
Would that include, like, if you have a program where your students attend a community college?
Does not, no.
Okay.
This does not count dual enrollment, WN, or like a college tuition, anything like that, no. Okay, Schedule T is a list of all your transfers. So I want to point out here something I saw on quite a few 387 reports where the transfers not really being accounted for. So you got to remember your funds that you're writing checks out of, let's just say special education, those funds can't have deficits at the end of the year. So for almost all the school districts and the vast majority of charter schools, your revenue, your special education revenue, your quarterly, I'm just going to single out special education. Your special education state revenue, this does not include your local SPED, but your state special education revenue combined with your federal revenue does not cover your expenses for special education. The requirements of all the IEPs you have in your schools and what you have to do to service those, you're probably most likely spending more money than you're getting in revenue to service that. So at the end of the year, you would have a deficit in your special education. For most school districts and a lot of schools, you're probably spending at least double what the revenue is you're getting between federal and state sources for special education. So that difference has to come from somewhere. 99% of us, it comes from your general fund. So you have to capture those transfers out of your general fund, and you would list like general fund 100, and it's going to general fund or to special education fund 250. What page you got that on, what tab I guess you would list what tab you capture that on, and then the amount. So if you transfer over $250,000 in your special education fund, it would go here. And then down here, it would be a transfer into your special education fund. So you would list fund 250 from your general fund. So it would go in your transfers in, and you would match that same 250,000 there. Same thing if your ELL and at-risk fund, maybe you have specific staff designated for that and you're not getting enough at-risk or ELL dollars, you're probably transferring money out of your general fund over to that. Remember, those funds, you don't have to treat those like grants. What I saw a lot on the 387s were people only matching expenditures to the amount of revenue they received. And they were leaving the balance of their expenditures, I'll just single out special education again, in their general fund. I cannot reiterate enough that we need to know the extent that you are spending in those special funds, especially special education, at-risk, ELL. The culmination of those 387 reports, the total sum of those is what goes off to LCB, the legislature. It's what NDE builds those budgets on for the next year. And as Melissa just said, charter schools are now going to probably get less special education funding next year. And if you guys aren't reporting the full extent of your special education, the narrative is, and you guys have all heard it, that charter schools are not servicing the same amount of at-risk kids, special education kids, ELL kids as districts are. So even though that there's October 1 count dates, if your expenditures don't back it up, it looks like, and I've heard it at the Commission on School Funding over the years, the charter schools aren't servicing the same severity of cases or the same percentage of cases. So it does appear that you guys have expenses, some of you, that you're leaving in the general fund because it exceeds the revenue you're getting. You can't worry about that. You got to record all of your expenses in those special education funds, ELL at risk, and then balance it out with a transfer from your general fund to zero it out. So I don't know, Melissa or Katie or Michael, if you want to add anything to that statement, because I know we've discussed that quite a bit. Okay. Looks like Robert, you have a question?
Yes. Correct. Our special ed expenditures exceed our federal and our state allocation, and then we used local sped. So is local sped on this schedule considered general fund? So I'm moving it from general fund to special revenue funds?
Actually, yes, correct. So local sped is confusing. And I went against this on the commission, but local sped is your general fund dollars that they're taking back and turning around and giving back to you. What local sped dollars are is the deficit going back 4 years now. When the PCFP first started, there was no such thing as local sped dollars. The transfers that districts and charter schools did from their general fund over to their special education fund to cover that difference, that deficit was captured as local sped dollars. So NDE could capture the full amount of special education expenditures. So then they earmarked that money going into the next biennium, called it local sped, and parceled it out of general fund and gave it back to everybody. So it is technically a transfer from your general fund. You can still have transfers above your local sped. And in fact, if you don't, this is something I tried to explain to schools throughout the 387 reviews, if you're only transferring local sped and that's balancing out your fund and you still have other expenditures above that, your local sped's never going to increase. Your local sped funding is never going to increase. So you more than likely will have dollars above and beyond even your local sped. So let's say you're getting $200,000 a year in local sped dollars, but your deficit in your special education fund is 400,000, then you should be showing a total of a $400,000 transfer out of your general fund, and you do not have to show the local sped portion. It's all a transfer out of your general fund. So if it's 400,000 is your deficit before you transfer over local sped or any other funding, then that's what it is. And if you're transferring that all out of your general fund, then it's all coming out of your general fund, and it just includes your local sped. And when you get to the 387 report, a portion of your general fund transfer will be that local sped transfer that we all had to do in those weird cells. Plus, down at the bottom, there was another transfer line where you would make up the difference out of your general fund. Any other questions? Michelle?
I don't know if this is gonna make sense, but if you when you do the transfers out, I guess on the, so you have your local, I don't have my NDE up, local special ed is like the 100 fund, but it's the 210, what is it? Like program code or something like that. I think is what it is. I'm not sure. Look it up. But is there a benefit or a disadvantage to moving the local special ed out and then taking the rest out of the general fund, or just taking it out of the general fund? Is there any difference in the way it looks?
No, because it is on the 387. They want to see that local sped transfer separate. It's exactly the
Okay.
same thing. It's just a portion of your general fund transfer. But remember, local sped is just a carve out of your general fund. It's not special education funding revenue. So when you code it, when that portion every month on your PCFP payments, it's local sped, you don't code that to fund 250. You code it to fund 100, and your revenue code is that 3115 revenue code, but it stays in your general fund. So for your budget, you don't have to break out local sped and a normal general fund transfer. It's all in the one line item. So again, if your special education total deficit is 400,000 and you got 200,000 in local sped, you wouldn't break out 200,000 here with local sped and then another 2,000 still coming out of your general fund. You're going to have one line item from your general fund to fund. So you would have 100 general fund, and it would go to fund 250 for $400,000. And this 400 would be inclusive of your local sped dollars. So I hope that clarifies that.
Yeah, it's how we're doing it. I just had a quick question. Thank you.
Yep, sure. Okay. Any other questions on your fund transfers? Cool. Okay. Moving on. Schedule 31. This is also new. Schedule 31 and Schedule 32. Read the description in the instructions that are with this, but they're two different tabs, but they're both vendor contracts. Schedule 31 is a list of vendor contracts that for services that don't currently mimic services you're already operating, such as an architect's contract. And it's not for goods. These are service contracts. Okay. So if you have a $200,000 contract with an architect, you hire a builder for, however much money to build a new building or renovate something or whatever, then that would go. These are services. All right. No school is going to have generally, none of you are going to have a position in your budget for an architect. So these on Schedule 31 are for those that offer services that are something that aren't similar that a school district would already have in-house. Okay. So you're going to list those contracts here and the reason that you need them. And again, I would encourage you to read through the contracts, and that's on it looks like page 9 of the instructions. Now, Schedule 32, These are what they call privatization contracts. So this is where you would list contracts for things like temp agencies. So if you're using a hiring agency or a temp agency to hire classroom aides, for example, because you can't find any, maybe you're paying a company to help you line up your subs and they're actually paying the subs. So again, kind of like a temp agency, you would list those contracts here because those are positions that maybe in a perfect world you would have in-house. Okay. The other thing would be like maybe you're outsourcing your psych or your speech or some special education stuff. That would go on this tab. Um, School districts have things like landscaping usually in-house. So maybe if you outsourced your building maintenance or your landscaping, you could arguably put that here because a lot of schools and districts have a maintenance person on staff who handles that kind of stuff. So these are what would be called privatization contracts. They're trying to capture things that are basically being outsourced that could be generally insourced, something that you would have hired on. So that's a difference between Schedule 1 and Schedule 32, as near as I can tell, and from what NDE also kind of confirmed to us. Okay, any questions on these tabs? Michelle?
Sorry, can you just what about like auditors, attorneys, like back office services, things like that? Does that go under the 31 or 32?
I would argue attorneys. I mean, yeah, some school districts have attorneys on retainers, but I would put your legal contracts if you have them. If you have a specified contract for a specified amount, then yeah, I would put that there. Accountants, no. Auditors, no. Those would go on Schedule 31, not 32. Nobody's going to have an auditor on staff, right? Or something like that. So I would put those on Schedule 31.
Yeah, because you have like a contract, right? It's like
Yeah.
for an auditor or like a financial back office services, those types of things. You have contracts for the year, so 31.
I would say back office service providers go on Schedule 32 because you are outsourcing something that is similar or what would be considered normal operating that would be in-house for a school or a school district. So if you're outsourcing HR or you have a back office service provider, you would list that contract on Schedule 32.
Okay, so an easy way to maybe explain it for me to understand is that if it's a position that possibly could be housed in or in-house position, but you're outsourcing it, that's 32. Anything else for services, like you said, should go under the 31. Anything else?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Also in that might be if you're outsourcing food service, you have a company that's coming in that's handling your meal service, your lunch or your breakfast or something like that, that would go on Schedule 32 as well. But again, that's what Schedule 32 is for. 31 are those things that aren't generally part of normal school district. And you got to remember, these forms were built for school districts, right? So you almost have to think what's normal for a school district and what you're outsourcing, and that's how you would divide up between those two schedules. Okay, any other questions on Schedule 31, 32? We're almost done. I was hoping to keep it to an hour. I apologize. I'll get done here in a second. Okay, no other questions. We are going to jump back to the modified schedules, AA modified and AA1. I'll be honest, I don't feel these two tabs, these are kind of summary tabs of all your B schedules, your revenues and expenditures. They're very district focused, so they are a little confusing. Do your best to fill it out. But what I would say is that the tabs that need to be accurate, that are similar to the old budget tabs, are those B schedules. Your revenue, the stuff we went through in depth, those are the ones by program and function. They really need to be accurate. If you struggle with this one, and aren't sure, honestly, I would hesitate on filling it out. But this is essentially a summary of those tabs. And so we grayed out and should have anything in gray, you should not be filling out. And they're probably locked to where you can't. Because they are specific to districts, especially when you get into property tax resources and tax rates, those sorts of things. But this is a summary. So Schedule AA modified is kind of a summary of your revenue, summary of your 1,000 local, 3,000, and you're going to break it out between column E, which is state education funding. Again, that's that funding on Schedule B1. That's your PCFP funding, at risk, all those weighted funds plus your base funding. That's going to go in this column here. So more than likely, column E9 is going to be the sum of that. And then any local funds would be considered non-property tax resources. So all those things like interest, fees you collect, donations, whatever that's captured in all those other revenue codes, that would probably go in column D. And you would capture that. And then, of course, if you're transferring anything in. So this whole top section is your general fund. That's your fund 100. That's your whole top section. Down here is your other funds. So you can see you got at-risk, English language learner, gifted and talented down here. That comes from your state funds. So anything in blue would come out of those state education funds that are on tab B1. So again, SPED revenue, this is your local special education revenue. That's what goes in here. And then if you had other proprietary funds, and again, these are for board authorized separate funds. If you have something in your general fund, then it goes up here up top. And then you also need to record any fund transfers in. So in your special education fund, if you're transferring in 400,000 that you listed on that funds transfer tab, that 400,000 would go right there. And you would show that in your special, that's actually, I'm sorry, that's special revenue fund. That's separate. That's not special education. Where is special education? English learners. No, they don't even have special education listed. You can list other funds down here. So there are a couple blank boxes to list. Again, to me, this is a district tab, but NDE wanted us to do our best to fill it out. So the reason I said I thought you should back into it is so you could match your revenue totals here with your Schedule BB6, which is your total revenues. So AA modified is revenues, AA-1 modified is your expenses. And so these should match in total the sum of your B schedules. So do your best to fill them out. If Department of Taxation, in my opinion, if Department of Taxation says we did them wrong, then they can help us do them right. But we really didn't get any good direction on how to fill these out specific to charter schools. And so I would say do your best. One thing on AA1 I will point out is you do have your ending fund balance. And you also have contingency. You can break out contingency as a percentage of all those different object codes or all those different program codes, or you can also put contingency, well, I think total ending fund balance right here in row, you could put a sum total of contingency in cell G16. And honestly, that's what I would do rather than try to break it out. I would go to cell G16, row 16, that's there for contingency, and I would put your total contingency in there. And then you also have fund transfers out, and that would go on line 15. So if you're transferring out $400,000 from your general fund to your SPED, that would go right there. You'd put your 400,000. This would be a total though. So if between SPED ELL and at risk, you were transferring out 500,000, then you would put that total right there into that cell. Even though there's a transfer out for every program, it doesn't really make any sense to me. I think it goes right here on that row and that row. Okay, any questions on those modified tabs? I'll do my best to answer them.
There was a question if you have to complete both Schedule AA and Schedule AA modified or just one.
No, and we actually, in the newest version, we blocked off AA, Department of Taxation. So AA and AA1, those are just different versions of the modified ones. They're the old version, and Department of Taxation updated them with these modified ones. They are allowing districts to use the AAs, but after we looked at them, they were even more confusing than the AA modifieds because they didn't have things like transfers in and out, and they also didn't have contingency. So we chose as SPCSA to confine you guys to the modified tabs. So only do the modified ones. That way it's consistent across all charter schools. And if we have any questions or if Department of Taxation has any direction on how to better fill those few tabs out, we're all on the same ones. Okay. I'm going to stop there. And questions on anything throughout this workbook? You'll notice in this workbook, there's nothing in here about your, PERS liabilities, your capital lease, GASB adjustments, other than that capital lease schedule that you might put over there. I don't believe there's any depreciation things in here. This is really your fund basis that would coincide with what you would report on the 387, which again, the 387 doesn't have any of those adjustments either. Okay, Katie, I will turn it back over to you.
And Michelle did just ask a question about autosave. Michelle, honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I think it might depend on where you've saved it, because at least for me, if I save something in Drop or in SharePoint or OneDrive, it will autosave. But if it's just like on my local drive, it won't. So I'm not sure if that is helpful, but I'm not sure how to change that functionality of the document.
So these are due April 15th.
Yep.
And they need to be sent to, and these do not go, this tentative budget does not go. So past instructions said you send it to, I think, Department of Taxation, NDE, SPCSA. This tentative budget, Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, only goes to NDE and uploaded to Epicenter to SPCSA. It doesn't go off to LCB or Department of Taxation.
I believe that's, yes.
Yes, so do not reach out to Department of Taxation. We were told specifically that's not allowed to happen. And these need to go directly to NDE and uploaded to Epicenter. Remember, NDE does not pull from Epicenter. These have to go to both NDE and Epicenter. And if you have questions in the meantime, you run into stuff, we're happy to help. Please email Katie, let them know whoever you want copied on that email if they have questions.
Yeah, you can just contact me directly and then or Michael, and we can kind of go from there as other people are looking at this, but feel free to reach out to us should you have any questions. I'm going to upload this recording, which I'm actually going to stop now, to our YouTube channel, and then I will send it out in the link in the Wednesday email tomorrow.